Do you feel guilty?
No. Me personally, no. I knew I could do nothing for them. I couldn't help them. Otherwise, I'd have been locked up.
In the spring of 1945, while Europe buried its dead, tens of thousands of men and women who had administered the Nazi concentration camp system removed their uniforms, put away their insignia, and disappeared into the chaos of a collapsed civilization. They had operated concentration camps, extermination centers, and transit prisons in which millions of people perished. Now, in a matter of days, they transformed themselves into ordinary civilians. Historians estimate that approximately 50,000 men served as SS guards throughout the camp system during the war. On April 15, 1945, British troops of the Second Army entered Bergen-Belsen. What they found exceeded the previous experience of any of the soldiers present. Approximately 60,000 prisoners survived in conditions of extreme hunger, typhus, and widespread decomposition. Colonel James Johnston counted 13,000 unburied corpses scattered throughout the compound. The spring temperature accelerated putrefaction. The smell could be perceived several kilometers from the outer perimeter. British military photographers arrived that same day and began documenting. The cameras did not stop. What they recorded would forever change the public discussion about what had happened in the camps. Bergen-Belsen had not originally been designed as an extermination camp. In its early years, it functioned as a transit camp and a prisoner of war camp. But in the final months of the war, when the Reich began evacuating the camps in the east in the face of the Soviet advance, thousands of prisoners were forced to march westward. Bergen-Belsen received wave after wave of evacuees without provisions, without sanitary infrastructure, without the capacity to sustain them. By January 1945, it held around 22,000 people. By March, the figure exceeded 60,000. The wooden barracks, built to house several hundred, contained thousands. In some of them, corpses remained among the living for days because there was not enough personnel to remove them. What distinguished Bergen-Belsen from other camps at the moment of liberation was that the SS personnel had not had time to flee. The speed of the Allied advance trapped them. Commandant Josef Kramer and dozens of staff members were arrested on site the very day of liberation. Kramer, who had previously served as deputy commandant at Auschwitz-Birkenau under Rudolf Höss, was detained while still wearing his full uniform. British soldiers photographed him in handcuffs next to the bodies his camp had produced. Among those detained was Irma Greze, 22 years old, head of female guards since January 1945. She had arrived at Bergen-Belsen from Auschwitz, where she had worked since March 1943. Before Auschwitz, she had completed her basic training at Ravensbrück, the Reich's main concentration camp for women. She was 1.68 meters tall, had blonde hair and light-colored eyes, and carried a leather whip and a pistol at the moment of her arrest. She was arrested on April 17th in her quarters near the main entrance. Her prisoners called her the Blonde Angel of Auschwitz, a nickname whose irony was deliberate and bitter. In Auschwitz, where she had reached the rank of Rapportführerin, responsible for prisoner roll calls, her methods had made her notorious even within the camp system, which set few limits on brutality. Juana Bormann was found hiding in a storage shed on April 16th. She weighed barely 45 kilograms and was 52 years old. Testimonies from survivors identified her with a uniformity that could hardly be coincidence. She was the guard who carried everywhere a trained attack dog and used it to tear apart women who collapsed during roll calls. Her prisoners called her the Weasel, a name that referred both to her physical appearance and her methods. She had served in Auschwitz and in the Budi labor camp before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen. The dog was shot on the spot. Bormann told the soldiers she worked in the kitchen. No survivor confirmed that version. Elisabeth Volkenrath, whose name also appears transliterated as Volkenrat in some trial documents, had supervised 400 female guards across 3 camps between 1941 and 1945, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and Birkenau. She was 31 years old at the time of her capture. Records of Operation Bernhard, captured in Sachsenhausen and later presented at the trial, showed the systematic movement of female guards between camps as the facilities expanded. Each transfer was accompanied by a promotion and a salary increase. The SS administered murder as a professional career path with ranks and performance rewards. Meanwhile, in southern Germany, the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions of the United States Army liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945. They found more than 30,000 prisoners and approximately 560 SS members still inside the compound. The sight of freight cars filled with corpses, a death train of 39 wagons from Buchenwald that had never been unloaded, and the physical condition of the survivors produced a visceral reaction among American soldiers. Several captured guards were executed on the spot by U.S. troops in what Army reports recorded as an incident of poor control under the circumstances. General George S. Patton, who visited the camp days later, vomited upon seeing the inside of the barracks. Similar scenes were repeated at Buchenwald, liberated on April 11th by the 9th Armored Division, at Mauthausen, liberated on May 5th by the 11th Armored Division, and at Flossenbürg, liberated on April 23rd by the 90th Infantry Division. In each case, SS personnel who had not fled were immediately detained. Some attempted to blend in among the prisoners, others presented forged identity documents. A few were recognized by the survivors themselves before soldiers could intervene. The Nazi concentration camp system had been colossal in scale. Historians estimate that approximately 50,000 men served as SS guards across the network of installations during the war. They were joined by several thousand women Aufseherinnen. According to the records of the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, which in 2007 opened its more than 30 million documents to public scrutiny, most of these women came from ordinary backgrounds: peasants, factory workers, secretaries, nurses. Recruitment remained voluntary until 1944. The SS placed advertisements in ordinary newspapers offering the positions with good wages, free housing, and medical benefits. No prior experience was required. The internal hierarchy of the men's camps was equally heterogeneous. In Auschwitz, for example, guards came from multiple national backgrounds. The Reichsdeutsche, Germans born within the borders of the state, formed the core and occupied all command positions. But their numbers declined sharply as the war progressed, from 85% in 1940 to 52% in 1943, as the demands of the Eastern Front drained the camp garrisons. To compensate for these losses, the SS incorporated Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, born in Yugoslavia, Romania, Poland, and Ukraine, along with Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Latvian auxiliary guards trained at the Trauniki camp southeast of Lublin. Approximately between 2,000 and 4,000 guards passed through that facility during the war. John Demjanjuk himself, whose case would reverberate decades later, was trained at Trauniki. The British Army's War Crimes Investigation Unit arrived at Bergen-Belsen on April 23rd. Under the command of Colonel Leo Gen, over 6 weeks, investigators interviewed 850 survivors. The names of the same perpetrators appeared again and again in independently taken statements: Grace, Volkenrath, Bormann, Hertha Ehlert, Frieda Walter. By June 1st, the British had compiled 400 pages of witness testimony. The picture that emerged was not one of a few exceptional individuals. It was that of an organized structure with ranks, salaries, promotions, and performance evaluations, which had functioned for years and was now, for the first time, facing a court. The Bergen-Belsen trial, September 1945. Lieutenant Colonel T.M. Backhouse opened the first Bergen-Belsen trial on September 17, 1945, in the Lüneburg courthouse exactly 5 months after liberation. 45 defendants appeared before a British military court. 11 were women. The courtroom measured approximately 9 by 12 meters and had no air conditioning. The outside temperature reached 31 degrees Celsius. The trial lasted 60 days of hearings and heard testimony from hundreds of survivors, doctors, soldiers, and investigators. It was the first war crimes trial partially broadcast on radio in Europe. The central thesis of the prosecution was novel and risky. Backhouse did not argue only that the defendants had committed individual acts of violence, which were also documented, but that the mere fact of voluntarily participating in the operation of a concentration camp where systematic crimes were committed made them participants in those crimes. It was a theory of structural collective responsibility that the defense rejected vehemently and that the courts accepted only partially, requiring in most cases proof of specific acts. Irma Grez entered the defendant's dock wearing a grey dress and no makeup. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The testimonies that accumulated against her over the course of weeks constituted one of the most detailed profiles of individual criminal conduct ever assembled in a post-war trial. Witness after witness described her selecting prisoners for death during morning roll calls at Auschwitz, beating women with leather truncheons and releasing dogs on groups of children. A Hungarian survivor testified that in May 1944, during the weeks when massive transports of Hungarian Jews were arriving at Auschwitz, more than 10,000 people per day at the peak, Grese directly pointed the elderly and women with small children to the left, toward the gas chambers. Grace's personal diary, seized at the time of her arrest, was presented as evidence at the trial. The entries were methodical and devoid of emotion. Today, I selected 230 for special treatment. The new transport of Hungarian women appeared healthy. In another entry, she described the arrival of a group of Dutch women and commented on which ones she considered suitable for certain tasks. The prosecutor pointed out to the court that the diary was the administrative record of a person who had completely internalized the bureaucratic language of extermination. Special treatment meant gassing. Suitable meant capable of working to death instead of dying immediately. Dr. Fritz Klein, a camp physician tried alongside Grese, provided testimony that shed light on the training process of the guards. He confirmed that they received specific medical training on how to identify weakness, illness, and pregnancy at first glance, without diagnostic instruments. They learned to distinguish in seconds during a dawn roll call under the rain who could remain useful and who had to be eliminated. They also learned to administer lethal phenol injections directly into the heart. Grese, according to the trial records, carried out her first execution using this method in April 1943, when she was 19 years old, less than 3 months after arriving at Auschwitz. Grace's room in Bergen-Belsen, searched at the time of her arrest, contained objects whose origin admitted no ambiguity. There was soap made from human fat, lampshades made from tattooed skin, and jewelry taken from corpses. Her braided leather whip, described in testimony as the instrument with which she routinely struck female prisoners in the face, was made, according to the forensic analysis presented at trial, from treated leather of human origin. When the prosecutor presented these objects before the courtroom remained in absolute silence for several minutes. Elisabeth Volkenrath remained motionless during most of the testimony. Her personnel file, recovered from the partially destroyed SS archives, showed a trajectory of advancement. She had entered the camp system in 1941 as an entry guard, had been promoted to Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor, in 1943, and had remained at that rank until the end of the war. Survivors identified her as the woman who made the selection decisions every morning. Her finger pointed to the left for the gas chamber, to the right to continue working. Dr. Adelaide Houtval, a French physician who had been a prisoner at Auschwitz and survived to testify, described that Volkenrath personally supervised the medical experiments carried out on women without anesthesia, noting the time it took for them to lose consciousness and to die. Volkenrath's defense used the argument that the lawyers for all the accused repeated with variations. They were officials following orders within a hierarchical structure, and responsibility lay with those who had given the orders, not with those who carried them out. The prosecutor responded by documenting cases in which the guards had acted beyond any orders received, inflicting violence on their own initiative and with evident personal satisfaction, according to testimony. The distinction between following orders and acting on one's own initiative would become one of the central axes of legal debate in all subsequent trials. Juana Bormann did not attempt to maintain composure. When the survivor Anita Laser described seeing Bormann's dog tear apart her friend Rachel during a roll call, Bormann shrugged from the defendant's bench and examined her nails. The prosecutor presented evidence that Bormann had trained the dog specifically to attack human genitals. When asked by the prosecutor, Bormann replied without lowering her gaze, "Dogs must eat." Trial records note that several witnesses in the courtroom cried upon hearing that response. The judges did not change their expressions. The Bergen-Belsen trial was extensively covered by the international press. British newspapers published daily summaries of the testimonies. In Germany, where access to Allied press was limited but increasing, some Germans learned for the first time the specific details of what had happened in the camps. The most common response, recorded in Allied intelligence reports on the state of German public opinion, was disbelief or distancing. That had happened somewhere else, with other people. Ordinary Germans, the reports insisted, preferred to see the trial as something that concerned the Nazis, not Germany. On November 17, 1945, Backhouse read the verdicts before a room with 300 observers. 11 guards stood when they heard their names. Irma Gress, guilty of crimes against humanity, sentenced to death by hanging. Elisabeth Volkenrath, guilty, death by hanging. Juana Bormann, guilty, death by hanging. Herta Ehlert received 15 years in prison. She had supervised selections at Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, but the court found that the specific testimonies against her did not reach the threshold for capital charges. Her case illustrated the technical difficulty that would haunt post-war trials for decades. The difference between supervising a system that killed and proving that a specific person had killed a specific person at a specific moment was legally enormous. Frieda Walter received 3 years for participating in documented beatings, though not in direct killings. Ilse Forster received 10 years for supervising forced labor detachments that killed hundreds through exhaustion. Gerda Steinhoff received a full sentence of 15 years. After her release, she attempted to return to the family farm in East Prussia, but that territory was already part of the Soviet Union, and she was denied entry. She settled in West Berlin and worked in a textile factory. East German authorities requested her extradition in 1972 for crimes committed in the Stutthof camp. West German courts denied the request. She died in Berlin in 1979. The executioner, Albert Pierre Point, arrived at Hameln prison on December 12, 1945. He was the official executioner of British military justice, a man who had carried out more than 400 executions throughout his career. He checked the gallows mechanism at 6 in the morning on December 13th. The drop calculations were made according to the body weight and neck measurement of each condemned woman to ensure that death would be instantaneous by cervical fracture and not by slow strangulation. At 8:03, Elisabeth Volkenrath walked toward the gallows. She wore the standard prison uniform and wooden clogs. Pierre Point placed the rope and adjusted the knot behind her left ear. He said nothing. The trapdoor opened at 8:03. Her neck broke instantly. At 8:15, Juana Bormann struggled with the guards. It took 4 men to hold her still while Pierre Point placed the rope. Her last words, officially recorded by Captain James McCallum, the prison doctor who acted as the official witness, "I loved my dog more than any human." The drop occurred at 8:18. She stopped moving after 90 seconds. At 8:30, Irma Gresse approached the gallows with a calm that the witnesses present described as deliberate and calculated. She refused the black hood that was offered to the condemned to cover the face at the moment of execution. She looked directly at the witnesses while Pierre Point adjusted the rope. When she was asked for her last words, she said, "Schnell." Fast. She died at 8:33. She was 22 years old. The bodies hung for 20 minutes, as required by British military law protocol. McCallum confirmed death by broken neck in all 3 cases. The bodies were taken down at 8:53 and placed in simple, unmarked wooden coffins without a religious service. In the cells of Block C, second floor, the other condemned women waited. Each had been allowed to write 1 letter per week during the weeks leading up to the execution. Irma Gresse had written to her sister, "I regret nothing. Germany will rise again." Other trials, other sentences, Dachau, Krakow, and multiple destinations. While the Bergen-Belsen trial was unfolding, the Americans were organizing their own proceedings. The Dachau trials began in August 1945 and continued until December 1947. They involved personnel from Dachau, Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and Flossenburg. The legal thesis that structured them was blunt. Anyone who had served in a camp where atrocities occurred shared responsibility for those crimes. It was not necessary to prove a specific individual act. The executions resulting from these sentences took place at Landsberg prison. Maria Mandl was tried not in Germany but in Poland. She had served as head of the Women Guards at Auschwitz-Birkenau from 1942 to 1944. Survivor testimonies described a woman who directed rehearsals of the prisoners' orchestra that played while others marched toward the gas chambers. She was remembered playing the violin while children were being murdered. The Supreme National Tribunal in Krakow sentenced her to death. She was hanged in Krakow on January 24, 1948. Dr. Dorothea Binz had served as chief of the guards at Ravensbrück from 1943 to 1945, being responsible for selecting thousands of women for execution. Soviet authorities tried her and sentenced her to death. She was executed by firing squad in May 1947 in Bezow prison. She was 26 years old. The contrast between Allied justice systems was pronounced from the beginning. The Soviets proved to be more expeditious. Of 23 guards tried in Soviet courts, 20 received death sentences and 19 were executed. The Americans, British and French together, executed 16 guards out of a total of 112 tried between 1945 and 1949. Anna Klein had supervised medical experiments in Ravensbrück that killed more than 300 women. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1947 by an Allied tribunal. However, in 1956, she was released after serving 9 years. She moved to Argentina, where she found work as a governess for German expatriate families. She returned to Germany in 1973 when Argentina began to apply pressure through investigations into Nazi war criminals. She died in a nursing home in Bavaria in 1992. No one ever prosecuted her for the medical murders. Ruth Closius had worked in the Stutthof concentration camp from 1944 to 1945. She participated in selections and beatings of prisoners. Polish courts sentenced her to life imprisonment in 1946. In 1956, she was released. She moved to West Germany, where she worked as a postal employee until retirement. She was recognized by survivors at a memorial ceremony in 1983. A new investigation was opened but abandoned due to lack of evidence. She died in Hamburg in 2003. Margot Drexel received a life sentence but successfully appealed. The sentence was reduced to 15 years in 1950. She was released in 1956. She returned to Austria and worked as a hospital cleaner in Innsbruck. She was recognized by a Holocaust survivor in 1975. Austrian police investigated but found insufficient evidence for new charges. She died of cancer in 1980. Of 47 guards tried by Allied tribunals between 1945 and 1949, only 13 received death sentences. Only 11 were executed. The pattern that emerged was clear. 15-year sentences became 10 for good behavior. 10-year sentences became 6. Life sentences were revised in successful appeals. The law protected the perpetrators more efficiently than it had protected their victims. The eclipse of justice, the Cold War and the Amnesty of 1951. By the end of 1948, the wave of Allied trials had visibly lost momentum. The Dachau trials concluded in December 1947. The British and the French closed their proceedings shortly afterward. In Western Europe, attention shifted from punishment to reconstruction. Geopolitics had radically changed its axis. Context matters in understanding why what happened occurred. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan for the economic reconstruction of Western Europe. The Soviet Union responded by blockading West Berlin in 1948. NATO was formed in 1949. In that same year, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded as a sovereign state under Western supervision. The enemy was no longer Germany. The enemy was the USSR, and West Germany, with its territory at the heart of the confrontation, was now an indispensable ally. The government of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer understood this logic and used it with political skill. Adenauer openly argued that continuing war crimes trials threatened the social cohesion of a state that needed to stabilize quickly and that had to be rearmed as part of Western defense. Veterans groups, which in the Federal Republic of Germany represented a significant electoral bloc, pressed aggressively for the release of men they called soldiers rather than criminals. The language was deliberate. Reclassifying the convicted as soldiers fulfilling their duty amounted to claiming their moral rehabilitation. In 1951, the West German parliament passed amnesty laws that released thousands of convicted war criminals. Many had served only a fraction of their sentences. At Landsberg prison, where U.S. military tribunals had sent hundreds of convicts, including 28 men sentenced to death in the Dachau trials, clemency boards systematically reviewed cases. The US High Commissioner John J. McCloy, under political pressure from Adenauer's government and lobbying groups in Washington, commuted numerous death sentences and reduced life sentences. By 1955, almost all prisoners in Landsberg had regained their freedom. The impact extended beyond those who had already been convicted. Prosecutors across West Germany quietly closed ongoing investigations. The denazification courts, created by the Allies to process millions of Germans with compromised pasts, increasingly classified former Nazis as Mitläufer, followers, fellow travelers, rather than active perpetrators. This legal category, intended for minor cases, was increasingly and loosely applied to individuals whose level of participation in crimes was directly documented. It belonged to the language of organized impunity. Without a centralized investigative agency, the Zentralstelle would not be founded until 1958, cases fell through the cracks of a German judicial system deliberately fragmented into 11 independent states with separate prosecutors' offices that did not coordinate with one another. A suspect who moved from Bavaria to North Rhine-Westphalia effectively slipped out of any active investigation. Many guards simply resumed ordinary lives. They returned to their hometowns, found work in factories and shops, started families, and lived without consequences. Some assumed new identities or moved to different cities to avoid recognition. Others did not even bother. The social climate in Germany during the 1950s favored forgetting in an active, not passive way. There was a collective preference to look forward. German historians of the following decades would describe this period as a time of systematic suppression, in which perpetrators and witnesses consciously chose, mostly without external pressure, not to remember or ask questions. In that context, former guards who had returned to their communities were not a subject of conversation. Their neighbors did not ask, and they did not answer. The fate of Frieda Walter illustrates that reality with precision. Sentenced to 3 years in the Bergen-Belsen trial, she completed her sentence and was released in 1948. She moved to Hamburg, where she worked as a cleaner until her retirement. She changed her surname to Meyer. In 1952, she married a widower with 2 children. She never mentioned Bergen-Belsen to her new family. She died peacefully in 1986. No one in her immediate circle knew who she had been. The case of Ilse Forster followed a different but equally illustrative path. Sentenced to 10 years, she was released in 1955. She emigrated to Canada with falsified documents identifying her as a seamstress and settled in Manitoba. She worked in that occupation for decades. Canadian authorities discovered her true identity in 1978 thanks to investigations initiated by Nazi hunters. She was deported to Germany in 1981. She died in a nursing home in Munich in 1994 without having faced additional charges. Even more relevant is the scale of what occurred outside the judicial system. War crimes investigators estimate that between 3,500 and 4,000 women served as guards in concentration camps, and that fewer than 600 of them faced any form of legal proceedings between 1945 and 2023. Of the approximately 3,500 who were not prosecuted, the vast majority returned to ordinary lives during the early post-war years in the window between 1945 and 1955, when the justice system still had the theoretical capacity to reach them but not the political will to do so. For male guards, the situation was quantitatively even more pronounced. The estimated 50,000 men who served in the camp system produced, over the decades of combined Allied and German trials, about 7,000 convictions in total, according to the records of the Zentralstelle. That represents approximately 14%. The remaining 86% were never prosecuted for their activities in the camps. A fraction of the guards did not wait to see what the judicial system would decide. They fled. With falsified documents and support from sympathetic networks, some former SS members left Europe entirely. The main routes ran through Austria and Italy toward South America, where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay offered refuge. Spain under Franco also received former Nazis. Others reached Syria and Egypt. For lower-ranking guards, who did not have the public profile of Eichmann or Mengele and therefore were not the subject of active searches, emigration required less dramatic measures. Canada, Australia, and the United States accepted German immigrants during the 1950s, with verification procedures that varied widely in rigor and that, in practice, proved easy to overcome. Hermine Braunsteiner, from Queens, New York to Düsseldorf. The case of Hermine Braunsteiner is the axis around which the history of camp guards who found refuge in the West revolves, because it condenses in a single trajectory all the elements of the problem. Post-war institutional complicity, the insufficiency of immigrant verification systems, the slowness of the judicial response, and finally the real, though delayed, possibility of justice. Braunsteiner was born in Vienna in 1919. She left school at 15 and worked as a domestic servant and as a laborer in a brewery before applying in 1939 for a position as a guard at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, the principal women's camp of the Reich, located 90 kilometers north of Berlin. She was admitted in August of that year. Her application was voluntary. Ravensbrück was the only official training camp for female guards, the Oberaufseher in Schule, where between 1939 and 1945 approximately 3,500 women were trained and later distributed throughout the concentration camp system. At Ravensbrück, Braunsteiner completed her 8-week training, which included instruction in the use of weapons, National Socialist racial theory, and methods of controlling prisoners. The performance evaluations preserved in the camp archives describe her as energetic, disciplined, and effective in maintaining order. In practice, maintaining order at Ravensbrück meant supervising 12-hour forced labor shifts, conducting roll calls held at dawn under any weather conditions, and applying documented physical punishments, beatings with leather batons, kicks, deprivation of food, as a routine response to minor infractions. At Ravensbrück, she coincided with other guards whose trajectories intersect with hers in post-war archives. Dorothea Binz, Oberaufseherin of the camp between 1943 and 1945, was described by dozens of survivors as the most feared guard of Ravensbrück. She had begun as a domestic servant before applying for the position of guard in 1939 at the age of 19. She supervised the introduction and expansion of gas chambers at Ravensbrück in the final months of the war, when the camp, designed for 6,000 prisoners, held more than 45,000. She also oversaw medical experiments carried out in the camp, in which SS doctors performed amputations, introduced bacteria into deliberately opened wounds, and tested sulfonamides on Polish prisoners without consent or anesthesia. Binz was tried by the British, sentenced to death and executed in May 1947 in Hameln prison by the same executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, who had executed Gressen Bormann in December 1945. Herta Ehlert, another Ravensbrück guard who later served at Bergen-Belsen, was sentenced to 15 years in the Bergen-Belsen trial of 1945, later reduced. Released in 1953, she was arrested again by Poland in 1965 for crimes committed at the Maidanic camp, where she had served as Oberaufseherin before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Sentenced to life imprisonment in 1968, she died in prison in 1997. Her case is one of the few in which a former guard was prosecuted twice in 2 different countries and actually served a long sentence. Ruth Neudeck was an Aufseherin at Stutthof, a camp located near Danzig, where she served between 1944 and 1945. Survivor testimonies identified her as one of the most violent guards in the camp who beat prisoners during roll calls with a whip and participated in the selections that sent weak or sick women to the gas chamber installed at Stutthof in 1944. Captured by the Allies in 1945, she was tried in Poland and sentenced to death. Executed in 1946, Johanna Bormann, not to be confused with Juana Bormann of Bergen-Belsen, although the similarity of the name has generated confusion in some secondary documents, served at Auschwitz-Birkenau as an Aufseherin between 1942 and 1944. Personnel records from Auschwitz preserved in the Camp Memorial Archive show her as one of the guards with the highest number of positive disciplinary mentions in internal evaluations, which in the administrative language of the SS meant that she had been particularly effective in detecting and punishing infractions among prisonniers. Après l'évacuation d'Auschwitz en janvier 1945, elle fut transférée à Bergen-Belsen, où elle fut capturée et jugée. Revenons à Braunsteiner. En 1942, elle fut transférée de Ravensbrück à Maidanic, le camp d'extermination situé à la périphérie de Lublin, en Pologne occupée. Maidanic était l'un des 6 camps d'extermination de l'opération Reinhard, les camps conçus spécifiquement pour la mise en œuvre de la solution finale au moyen de chambres à gaz. À Maidanic, elle fut promue Rapportführerin, responsable des appels, puis Lagerführerin du camp féminin. Dans cette position, elle supervisait directement les autres gardiennes et coordonnait avec le commandant du camp les opérations de sélection sur la rampe. La sélection sur la rampe de Maidanic était le processus par lequel les convois arrivant des ghettos de Pologne et d'autres régions d'Europe étaient divisés en deux groupes, ceux qui pouvaient travailler et ceux qui seraient immédiatement gazés. Les personnes âgées, les enfants, les femmes enceintes et ceux qui arrivaient en mauvais état physique allaient directement au gaz. Braunsteiner prenait ses décisions en pointant du doigt. Les survivants de Maidanic, qui témoignèrent des décennies plus tard lors du procès de Düsseldorf, dans lequel Braunsteiner était l'un des 22 accusés, décrivirent un schéma de comportement constant. Maria Kaufmann, survivante polonaise, déclara qu'en novembre 1942, Braunsteiner sélectionna personnellement 102 enfants du camp féminin pour leur exécution. Les enfants étaient arrivés dans un transport en provenance du ghetto de Lublin. Ils avaient entre 3 et 14 ans. Braunsteiner les sépara de leur mère lors d'un appel, les aligna et les remit aux gardes masculins qui les conduisirent à la chambre à gaz. Une autre survivante, Zofia Murawska, décrivit comment Braunsteiner frappait les femmes qui résistaient à la sélection en utilisant les bottes à clous métalliques qui lui avaient valu son surnom. Certains témoignages décrivaient qu'elle piétinait parfois littéralement des femmes tombées au sol. Le procès de Maidanic à Düsseldorf fut, en termes de durée et de complexité, le procès pour crime de guerre le plus long de l'histoire judiciaire allemande jusqu'à la date de sa conclusion. Il débuta en novembre 1975 avec 22 accusés, dont plusieurs moururent ou furent déclarés inaptes à être jugés avant le verdict final. Les témoignages s'étendirent sur 5 ans et demi et inclurent des survivants venus de Pologne, d'Israël, de France et d'autres pays. Les juges délibérèrent pendant des mois avant de prononcer la sentence le 30 juin 1981. Braunsteiner fut condamné à la réclusion à perpétuité. 2 autres accusés reçurent la même peine. Plusieurs reçurent des peines allant de 3 à 12 ans. Certains furent acquittés faute de preuves directes concernant des actes individuels spécifiques, illustrant la barrière juridique qui ne serait pas surmontée avant le précédent Demjanjuk de 2011. Irmgard Huber était l'infirmière en chef de l'hôpital psychiatrique de Hadamar, l'une des installations du programme Action T4, le programme nazi d'euthanasie forcée qui assassina plus de 70 000 personnes atteintes de handicaps physiques et mentaux entre 1939 et 1941 au moyen de gaz au monoxyde de carbone puis d'injections létales. Le programme T4 fut le laboratoire où les SS perfectionnèrent les techniques d'extermination de masse qu'ils transféreraient ensuite dans les camps de la solution finale. Huber supervisa les opérations de la salle d'extermination de Hadamar, organisa le transfert des patients depuis des institutions de toute l'Allemagne et coordonna avec les médecins les listes de ceux qui devaient être éliminés. Elle fut jugée par les Alliés en 1945 et condamnée à 25 ans, libérée dans les années 50. Elle ne fut jamais poursuivie de nouveau. Ilse Koch, épouse du commandant de Buchenwald Karl Otto Koch, n'avait pas de rang officiel dans les SS. Les femmes mariées à des officiers ne pouvaient pas obtenir leur propre rang, mais elle exerçait une autorité de facto sur le camp féminin de Buchenwald et était également redoutée par les prisonniers masculins. Les témoignages présentés lors des procès de Dachau l'accusaient d'avoir ordonné la fabrication d'objets décoratifs, abat-jour, reliures de livres, avec la peau tatouée de prisonniers tués spécifiquement à cette fin. Elle fut condamnée à la réclusion à perpétuité par un tribunal militaire américain en 1947. Le haut-commissaire John McCloy, dans le cadre de la politique de clémence de 1951, réduisit sa peine à 4 ans, décision qui provoqua une tempête de protestations au Congrès des États-Unis. Un tribunal allemand la jugea de nouveau en 1951 et la condamna de nouveau à la réclusion à perpétuité. Elle se suicida en prison en 1967. Maria Mandl, head of the female guards at Auschwitz-Birkenau between 1942 and 1944, supervised more than 200 Aufseherinnen in the largest camp of the Nazi system. She was directly responsible for living conditions in the women's camp and participated in selections on the ramp. Survivors described her as musically cultivated. She created and protected a prisoners' orchestra that played when transports arrived at the ramp, and at the same time capable of ordering executions routinely. When the Soviet advance forced the evacuation of Auschwitz in January 1945, Mandl was transferred to Munich. She was captured by American forces, extradited to Poland, and tried in Krakow. She was hanged on January 24, 1948. One Bormann, indeed the Bergen-Belsen guard who was tried and executed in 1945, had previously served in Auschwitz between 1942 and 1943 before being transferred to the labor camp of Budi and finally to Bergen-Belsen. The SS personnel file recovered from partially destroyed archives showed a 12-year trajectory in the concentration camp system, beginning in camps in Germany before the war. She was one of the few guards who had entered the system before 1939, in the years when the camps mainly held German political prisoners. Her transition from that system to the wartime extermination system was gradual and uninterrupted, with no documented breaking point in her performance evaluations. The Maidanic trial left a legal lesson that German prosecutors would take decades to fully absorb. The 22 defendants had been tried under the traditional standard that required proving a specific individual act against an identifiable victim. That standard, designed for ordinary criminal law, proved inadequate for industrialized mass crime. The gas chambers of Maidanic had killed between 60,000 and 80,000 people. No one could identify the specific guard who had closed a specific valve on a specific date. The consequence was that perpetrators with direct and well-documented responsibility could be acquitted not because they had not killed, but because it could not be proven that they had killed a specific person. That barrier would not be demolished until the precedent established by the Demjanjuk case in Munich in 2011, when a German court accepted for the first time that serving in an extermination camp was in itself sufficient to establish complicity in all the murders committed in that camp during the period of service. It was a conclusion that many jurists considered obvious from the beginning, and that the judicial system took 66 years to adopt. The turning point: the 1958 Ulm trial and the creation of the Zentralstelle. The second half of the 1950s could have marked the definitive end of any attempt at justice. The trials had concluded, amnesties had emptied the prisons, and the German judicial system was looking in another direction. Then, in the spring of 1958, a trial in a small town in southern Germany changed everything. In Ulm, 10 former members of a combined SS and police unit were tried for their participation in the murder of thousands of Jewish civilians along the border between Germany and Lithuania in 1941. The trial was significant not so much for the crimes it documented, which were already broadly known, but for what it revealed about the perpetrators. These men had lived openly in West Germany for more than a decade. Some held positions in public administration. None had been seriously investigated. The Ulm trial exposed with surgical precision the extent to which the justice system had failed, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of will and coordination. The political response was swift. In December 1958, the ministers of justice of the 11 states of West Germany established a new agency in the city of Ludwigsburg. The Zentralstelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, known simply as the Zentralstelle, began operations in a former prison building with a small number of officials. Its mandate: gather evidence, identify suspects, and refer cases to local prosecutors. It was the first time that West Germany had an institution dedicated exclusively to tracking down those responsible for Nazi crimes still living within its borders. The work of the Zentralstelle led directly to the most significant trial of the following decades. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial took place between December 1963 and August 1965. 22 defendants faced charges for crimes committed in the Auschwitz complex. The proceedings lasted 20 months and heard testimony from more than 350 witnesses from 19 different countries. 6 defendants received life sentences. The trial was broadcast on the radio and extensively covered in the press, reaching millions of Germans who had preferred not to know. For the first time, the concentration camp system was described in detail before the German society that had ignored it. Over the following decades, the Zentralstelle helped bring nearly 7,000 individuals to trial. The figure appears significant. Yet compared with the estimated total number of perpetrators, tens of thousands of men and thousands of women, the proportion of those who faced legal consequences remained small. John Demjanjuk and the legal change of 2011. By 2010, time had become the principal ally of those who had escaped justice. Most camp guards were between 80 and 95 years old. The witnesses to their crimes were also aging or had already died. Proceedings that were initiated often ended without a verdict because the accused died or was declared unfit to stand trial. The legal barrier protecting most of them was technical but effective. To convict a former guard, German prosecutors needed to prove a specific criminal act linked to an identified victim. Belonging to the staff of a camp where massacres had occurred, even having served there for years, was not enough. This evidentiary standard made it nearly impossible to prosecute lower-ranking guards whose individual actions had not been documented with precision. John Demjanjuk was a retired mechanic from the automotive industry who had lived for decades in Cleveland, Ohio. Born in Ukraine in 1920, he had been captured by German forces during the Second World War. German prosecutors gathered evidence that he had served as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp in occupied Poland in 1943. Sobibor was designed specifically to kill. It was not a labor camp, but an immediate extermination center where every train that arrived brought people who would be murdered within hours. Prosecutors did not accuse Demjanjuk of any specific act. They accused him of having served at Sobibor. The legal theory was radical. Working at a place built for systematic murder was in itself sufficient to constitute complicity in every one of the killings that occurred during the period of that service. On May 12, 2011, a Munich court convicted John Demjanjuk as an accomplice to tens of thousands of murders committed during the period in which he served at Sobibor. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Demjanjuk died in March 2012 before his appeal could be resolved, but the legal precedent survived. For the first time in German judicial history, serving in an extermination camp was enough for a conviction without the need to demonstrate a specific individual act. The effect was immediate. German prosecutors, now armed with a new legal framework, launched investigations into elderly guards who had escaped justice for 7 decades. The race against mortality had officially begun. Oskar Gröning, the accountant of Auschwitz. Oskar Gröning was not a man who hid. For decades he had spoken openly about what he had done during the war. He did so not out of guilt, but because he wanted to refute Holocaust deniers. He had been there, he said. He had seen everything. It had happened. Gröning arrived at Auschwitz in 1942 at the age of 22 as a member of the SS. His task was not to select prisoners or operate the gas chambers. He was an accountant. His job consisted of collecting the money and valuables taken from prisoners when they arrived at the camp, counting them, and sending them to Berlin. He saw the trains arrive. He saw the selection on the platform. He knew perfectly well what the facility where he worked was used for. He served in Auschwitz between 1942 and 1944. He never denied his duties. In interviews for documentaries and in a letter addressed to a Holocaust denier preserved in the German archives, Gröning wrote that what had happened at Auschwitz was an indisputable historical fact and that he had been both a witness and a part of that system. In July 2015, a court in Nuremberg, the same city where Irma Gries had been tried 70 years earlier, convicted Oskar Gröning. He was 94 years old. The court found him guilty as an accomplice to the murder of 300,000 people. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The verdict confirmed that the Demjanjuk precedent would stand. Working at Auschwitz in any administrative capacity amounted to participation in the crime. Prosecutor Jens Lehmann argued before the court that Gröning had been part of a machine designed for extermination, that his routine accounting work helped keep that machine running, and that he therefore shared responsibility for its results. Defense lawyers argued that Gröning had attempted to be transferred away from Auschwitz on several occasions, which was verifiably true, and that his administrative role distanced him from direct responsibility. The court rejected these arguments. Holocaust survivors traveled from Israel, the United States, and Europe to testify or simply to be present. Eva Kor, who had been subjected to medical experiments in Auschwitz along with her twin sister, took Gröning's hand at the end of the trial and forgave him. The gesture was photographed and published around the world. It generated controversy among survivors and organizations who believed that individual forgiveness was incompatible with collective justice. Oskar Gröning died in March 2018 at the age of 96 without having served a single day of his sentence. Legal appeal procedures, combined with medical evaluations regarding his ability to withstand imprisonment, prevented him from entering prison. The last prosecutions, Stutthof, Sachsenhausen, and the race against time. Gröning's conviction opened a window that was closing rapidly. The Zentralstelle in Ludwigsburg compiled lists of potential defendants still alive in Germany and abroad. Prosecutors identified dozens of possible cases. Many disappeared before reaching trial. The accused died, or doctors certified that they were unable to withstand the proceedings. Reinhold Hanning had served at Auschwitz between 1942 and 1944. He was convicted in June 2016 by the Detmold court as an accomplice to 170,000 murders. He was 94 years old. He died in May 2017 before his appeal could be resolved. Hubert Zafka had served as a paramedic in the Auschwitz camp. In 2017, the Neubrandenburg court declared that he was not mentally fit to stand trial. The case was closed. Johann Rehbogen had worked as a guard at Stutthof between 1942 and 1945. His trial began in 2018. The proceedings were repeatedly interrupted due to health problems. The chief prosecutor argued that the precedent established in the Demjanjuk case and confirmed in Gröning made Rehbogen an accomplice to the murders committed during his service. The defendant, who was 95 years old, was declared unable to endure the full trial. In 2019, the case was dismissed. In 2020, German prosecutors announced charges against a woman, the first woman prosecuted under the new legal framework, who had worked as a secretary at Stutthof. Irmgard Fürchner, who was 96 years old when the trial began, fled her nursing home on the day she was due to appear in court for the first time. She was arrested a few hours later. The trial continued, and in December 2022, she was convicted as an accomplice to 10,505 murders. The sentence was 2 years suspended given her advanced age. The Fürchner case confirmed both the scope of the new legal framework and its practical limitations. A 96-year-old secretary who had typed orders in an extermination camp decades earlier could legally be convicted as an accomplice. But the conviction did not imply actual imprisonment, and for tens of thousands of lower-profile guards, the possibility of prosecution had disappeared with time. What remained unresolved? In 2016, construction workers renovating apartments in Munich discovered a cache of documents hidden inside a wall. The papers included complete personal files of female guards at Dachau with photographs, addresses, and family information. German prosecutors reviewed the archives. They concluded that all identified individuals had died. No further action was taken. In 2021, in Buenos Aires, workers demolishing a house in the Bernal neighborhood discovered a hidden room containing Nazi paraphernalia, SS uniforms, photographs, and personal documents belonging to concentration camp guards, along with identity documents showing how these individuals had obtained Argentine citizenship under false names. Authorities sealed the evidence pending an investigation. No charges were filed. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, which tracked Nazi war criminals until 2011, maintained files containing the names of 317 camp guards who had escaped justice. Most had fled to South America, Australia, or Canada. Of these, only 47 were extradited for trial. The center's last active prosecution occurred in 2006. Ingrid Metz had served as a communications officer at the Sobibor extermination camp. She coordinated the schedules of trains that delivered more than 200,000 victims to the gas chambers. British forces arrested her in 1945 but released her in 1947 due to lack of evidence. She returned to her hometown of Düsseldorf and worked as a telephone operator until her retirement. Police questioned her again in 1979 following new witness testimonies. Prosecutors declined to file charges, citing insufficient evidence and the passage of time. She died in Düsseldorf on a date not publicly recorded. Hermine Braunsteiner died in 1999 after 16 years in prison. Oskar Gröning died in 2018 without serving a single day of his sentence. Together they represent the two possible outcomes for guards who faced justice, one caught in time, the other too late. The vast majority were never caught at all. The collaborators of the East, non-German auxiliaries, policemen and guards. Not all the perpetrators who administered the Nazi system of terror wore German uniforms. Behind the structure of the camps and the massacres carried out in open fields, there existed a second layer of perpetrators whom history took decades to identify with precision, and whom post-war justice almost never reached: the collaborators of the East. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Belarusians and ethnic Germans from the occupied territories who actively participated in the Holocaust as camp guards, auxiliary police and special execution units. Without them, the extermination apparatus could not have functioned on the scale it ultimately reached. On July 25, 1941, Heinrich Himmler issued the formal order to create auxiliary police units composed of Ukrainians, Balts and Belarusians in the occupied territories. The new units were initially called Hilfspolizei, later renamed Ordnungsdienst in August 1941, and finally integrated into the Schutzmannschaft beginning in November of that year. By the end of 1941, approximately 45,000 men served in these formations, half of them in mobile battalions deployed outside their regions of origin. By 1942, the figure had reached 300,000, numerically surpassing the German police forces in the occupied territories. The Schutzmannschaft was divided into two operational branches. The Einzeldienst operated in cities and rural areas of its region of origin. It registered Jews, guarded ghettos, took part in roundups and escorted deportees. The Schutzmannschaft battalions served outside their areas of origin, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine, fighting Soviet partisans and supporting the German police in mass executions. These battalions were assigned numbers according to their region of origin: 1 to 15 for Lithuania, 16 to 30 for Latvia, 31 to 50 for Estonia, 51 to 100 for Central Russia, including Belarus, and 101 to 200 for Southern Russia and Ukraine. Kazys Čiurinskas was born in 1918 in Lithuania and had served in the Lithuanian army before the Soviet occupation. In the summer of 1941, with the arrival of the Germans, he volunteered for the newly formed Schutzmannschaft. As a guard at Fort 4 of Kaunas, Čiurinskas was present during August and September 1941, when approximately 1,800 Jews were shot at that location. Among those executed during that period were more than 500 Jewish intellectuals: doctors, lawyers, engineers, and artists. In September 1941, Čiurinskas participated in a mission in the surroundings of Kaunas that included the execution of 43 partisans in the village of Uzusaliai. He was later transferred to the 2nd Lithuanian Battalion, renamed the 12th Battalion in February 1942, which was sent to Minsk, where it operated under the 11th Battalion of the German Reserve Police, and took part in the murder of approximately 46,000 people, most of them Jews and Soviet prisoners of war. Čiurinskas was also present at the massacre of more than 5,000 Jews in the surroundings of the city of Swuk on October 27, 1941. Jonas Stelmokas, born in Moscow in 1916 of Lithuanian origin, had graduated from the Kaunas Military Academy in 1939 and served in the Lithuanian army until the Soviet occupation. He joined the Schutzmannschaft in the summer of 1941. On October 28 and 29, 1941, he participated in the Grosse Action, the Great Action, in the Kaunas ghetto. German policemen and Lithuanian auxiliaries surrounded the ghetto on the 28th and selected 1/3 of its population to be shot. The survivors of the ghetto, from behind their boarded-up windows, watched the column pass by. One of their testimonies, preserved in the archives of Yad Vashem, said, "We saw them march up the hill. We watched them, and we cried." Lithuanian policemen stripped the Jews, took their valuables, and pushed them into the pits where they were executed with machine guns. Approximately 9,200 people died in that 2-day operation. Stelmokas emigrated to the United States after the war. A federal court in Pennsylvania initiated denaturalization proceedings against him in 1992. Alexandras Lileikis had an even longer career in police work. He had served in the Saugumo Policija, the Lithuanian Security Police, since 1927, rising to deputy director in the Marijampol region and later deputy director for Vilna around 1939. Vilna, called Viln by the Jews and nicknamed the Jerusalem of the North, had a Jewish community that represented more than 40% of its population. With the arrival of the Germans in the summer of 1941, Lileikis returned from Germany, where he had remained during the Soviet occupation, and on August 20, 1941, he was appointed head of the Saugumo Policija for Vilna. In the autumn of 1941, about 130 Lithuanians worked under his command. Under his direction, the Saugumas identified, arrested, and handed Jews over to German and Lithuanian execution squads. Lileikis emigrated to the United States after the war. In 1996, a federal court in Massachusetts initiated denaturalization proceedings. Lileikis died that same year before the process could be completed. In Latvia, the collaborationist structure took on a specific form under the command of Victor Araj. Araj was born in 1910 and in July 1941 formed the Araj Commando, an auxiliary unit of approximately 300 men recruited from former soldiers, former police officers, and university students, directly subordinated to Rudolf Lange, SS Sturmbannführer and tactical coordinator of Einsatzgruppe A. The commando killed approximately 29,000 Jews during the summer and autumn of 1941, first operating in the Bikaniki area on the outskirts of Riga, and then moving through the countryside in operations to liquidate rural Jewish communities. In November 1941, in order to empty the Riga ghetto, the Germans mobilized the Araj's commando together with about 1,000 additional Latvians. Araj's men knocked on the doors of the ghetto at dawn on November 30th, while Lithuanian police organized the column of deportees toward the execution site at Rumbula. Araj was captured, tried and sentenced in West Germany in 1979 to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1988. The second in command of the commando was Konrad Skales, born in 1913 in Riga. He had served in the Latvian army, then in the Red Army after the Soviet annexation, and in 1941 deserted to join the Araj's commando, where he served as company commander and first lieutenant. He participated in the arrest and execution of Jews in Riga and in rural Latvia, and also served as a guard at the Salaspils labor camp. Calais emigrated to the United States after the war and later moved to Australia. Australian authorities investigated him in the 1990s. Canadian and British courts also examined his case at different times. No country succeeded in prosecuting him before his death in 2001. In Lithuania, the Ypatingasis Berries also operated, a specialized execution unit of between 40 and 60 men composed of Lithuanians under the command of Lithuanian and German SD officers. This small unit was responsible for the murder of approximately 10,000 people in different localities during September and October of 1941. Between 1941 and 1943, it served as a guard unit at Paneriai, an execution site and detention camp outside Vilna, where it participated in the murder of approximately 80,000 people. In Ukraine, the scale of collaboration was even greater. Around 100,000 Ukrainians served as auxiliary policemen, of whom approximately 35,000 were part of the mobile battalions of the Schutzmannschaft. John Kalimon, a Ukrainian born in 1921 in what was then Poland, worked as an auxiliary policeman in Lviv from at least May 1942 until March 1944. German records presented at his denaturalization trial in a federal court in Michigan showed that on August 14th, 20th and 21st, 1942, Kaliman escorted approximately 3,450 Jews from the ghetto to the embarkation points for deportation transports. During those 3 days, he used 8 rounds of ammunition. The record noted that 38 Jews were killed attempting to escape. In 2007, the court ordered his denaturalization. Bohdan Kozy, a Ukrainian from Galicia and a member of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists since 1939, joined the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police in the city of Lisiets in April 1942. He participated in the roundups of Jews during the summer of that year. In the autumn of 1943, he personally detained and shot a Jewish girl who was hiding in the house of a Polish woman in Lisiets. During those same weeks, he participated in the murder of the Kandler family, identified in the records of the case. Cozy emigrated to the United States after the war. A federal court in Florida initiated denaturalization proceedings in 1982. He was deported. The case of Konrad Schellong illustrates the German component of camp guards who also made their way to the United States. Schellong was born in 1910, joined the SA in 1932, the Nazi Party and the SS in December of the same year, and in 1934 began serving as a guard at the Sachsenberg camp in Saxony. From 1936 to 1939, he was stationed at Dachau commanding guard units. He was fully aware of the systematic mistreatment of prisoners, exhausting labor, malnutrition, and severe physical punishments. He instructed the guards under his command to shoot any prisoner who attempted to escape. He emigrated to the United States. In 1982, a federal court in Illinois initiated his denaturalization, which was confirmed on appeal in 1986. Algimantas Dailide was born in 1921 in Kaunas. The Soviets expelled him from the forestry school where he was studying because of his anti-communist attitudes. With the arrival of the Germans, he joined the Saugumo Policia in Vilna. His daily work consisted of arresting Jews suspected of having escaped from the ghetto, interrogating them, confiscating their money, jewelry, and passports, and handing them over to the Germans for execution. At his own denaturalization trial, Dailide described his work in administrative terms. His function was to separate serious offenders, Jews and communists, from ordinary criminals in Lukiski's prison. The distinction was in practice the difference between surviving and being shot. He was denaturalized by a court in Ohio in 1997. Lithuania prosecuted him in 2004, but he was acquitted on the argument that his actions had been committed under Soviet coercion. The case of Bishop Valerian Trifa in Michigan exposed a different dimension of collaborationism, propaganda as a precondition for massacre. Trifa was editor of the student newspaper Libertatea in Romania, where he published systematic anti-Semitic articles, and president of the National Union of Romanian Christian Students. On January 20, 1941, he delivered a speech before approximately 5,000 students in Bucharest that triggered a pogrom lasting 3 days and killing about 120 Jews. The perpetrators killed Jews in an industrial slaughterhouse and hung their bodies from the metal hooks normally used for cattle. An American eyewitness described the amount of blood that was spilled. Trifa arrived in the United States after the war, was ordained an Orthodox bishop, and in 1955 delivered the opening prayer at a session of the U.S. Senate. The OS1 initiated proceedings in the 1970s. In 1984, Trifa agreed to renounce his citizenship and was deported to Portugal, where he died in 1987. The experiment of justice regarding collaborators from the East proved to be even less satisfactory than that exercised against German guards. The documents proving their participation were mostly in the hands of the Soviet Union, which did not share them during the Cold War. The witnesses who could identify them were survivors from the East living in Israel, Poland, or the USSR itself. Denaturalization trials in the United States required evidence according to the American civil standard, which was high, and time worked relentlessly in favor of the suspects. For every Kalaman who was denaturalized, dozens of men with comparable records died quietly in Wisconsin, in Toronto, or in Melbourne, without anyone ever having had the chance even to pronounce their names in a courtroom.